The Crystal Charter, Daughter of the Red Seal. Read and written by Rebecca Sewell. Chapter 14. Bile rose in Maebe's throat at the smell which was wafting through the air, the grease of human flesh carried on the dark smoke drifting past them. Black logs trapped under the flames transformed into the shapes of charred limbs. "Where's the flitter?" Mouse whispered with a curious edge. She produced it from her cloak pocket. Crushed wings and wire cage bent out of shape. It still struggled in her grip. Understanding struck her numb. "No," she mouthed. "Just check," he encouraged. Sighing, Maebe loosened her grip on the crumpled device. It twitched close to the edge of the ledge that they were hiding behind, towards the camp. Maebe gripped it before it could tumble over the edge and alert anybody. "So?" he urged. "Absolutely not," she whispered furiously as she could manage. "I made a promise to find the missing goat herders, and I think we know where they are," he reminded her. "They have no idea that we're here. The whole camp looks like it's listening to that black-eyed beauty over there. We go have a quick look, then just do a runner, with or without prisoners." "Your goat herders are right there, keeping those fires going for the warlocks," she hissed. "May, they might have children. Think of the children, May. That could be somebody's papa trapped down there," he pestered, sticking his bottom lip out and dipping his eyebrows at each side. She couldn't believe her answer tumbled out. 1 minute, she growled. "We look for 1 minute. But know this, right now. I hate you." Mouse smiled victoriously and pulled his long blade from his waist with a wink. He ripped his vibrant jacket off, reversing it so that the brown silk lining faced outside. One of Maebe's own daggers appeared in her hand. She hid her shaking from Mouse by squeezing it tight. They tiptoed down a rocky path into the forest basin, hidden from the crowd of murderous warlocks by tents and shrubs. Mouse listened, leading them, stopping at the flap of each tent before poking his head swiftly in. Maebe watched behind them. On and on they went, checking every tent on the outskirt, until Mouse led them into the inner ring. Maebe's heart jumped in her throat at every shadow. If they were spotted, she had no doubts they'd be blasted with raw magic and drained. "Here!" Mouse gasped, waving his hand to call Maebe to the flaps of a navy tent. Inside were 2 prisoners. An umber-haired man in hunter's clothes, with eyes the colour of the forest, brown flecked with green. Next to him was a small boy tied to a wooden post, head collapsed down to his chest. Maebe dashed to him to check his pulse. She used her blades to free him from the ropes binding him to the post. "Oh, he's fine," groaned the man from the other side. "Well, not fine, but alive." He choked a laugh as Mouse knelt to flee him with his blade. "No one else?" Maebe asked the stranger. "No, my love. We are the only 2 of the guards left," he rasped. "We're lucky there's no guards," whispered Mouse with a satisfied chuckle. Maebe wildly gestured at the large crystal sat on the table in the middle of the room. Warlocks were made up of witches who had abandoned their former guild to seek more power. A former artificer could easily produce crystal-powered items for the warlocks. "She's right. You're stuck with us," the hunter mumbled. "That's a movement crystal. Charged to inform them if anybody leaves its presence." "Well, we'll just have to take that with us too," Mouse smiled. The hunter suppressed a bark laugh. "Well met, friend. The name's Azra," he offered Mouse. Azra shook the ropes free from his hands and sniffed deeply, eyes flitting between Mouse's jacket and the tent flap. The dark fabric slid up, revealing late morning light shining high above. A coal-eyed figure with a warrior's braid tucked under the flap stood straight. It took only an instant, but the dagger in Mouse's hand flew aside, skittering along the floor. Maebe's enchanted blades carried her through the air and smacked into a wooden post behind where she'd been standing. The blade stuck in the wood, with Maebe hanging from it until she would let go. Her blood froze in her chest. The warlock flashed a sinister grin, surprised by the act of sending an intruder flying when he'd only meant to disarm them. Suddenly, he stumbled, held by some force Maebe couldn't place. The warrior's braid wrapped itself around his throat as his knee crunched painfully into the earth of the tent. A little assistance, friends. I can't hold him for long, Azra gritted out, hands raised and face strained with the use of magic. Hedge witch, Maebe realised. He'll be overpowered by a warlock in no time. Of the 7 guilds of witches, hedge witches were considered the lowest. Technically, they were witches who were unaffiliated with any other guild, mostly because they were considered too weak, to the point of being almost human. Some dwelt in the Green Kingdom as merchants for artificer mind crystals or charging devices, but most of them worked to try and earn an admission into another guild. There was a saying in the Green Kingdom that everybody knew. Only the poor, or desperate, would ever trust a hedge witch. She glanced at her daggers, stuck awkwardly in the tent post. Mouse's were stuck in the same place on the other tent post. The struggle between the 2 magic users was continuing in rampant silence. You crystal, Azra gritted out to Mouse. Crystal? Mouse repeated. Confusion smeared over his face. He lifted a hand to his jacket. Maebe started to lecture him. That won't do anything, that's just a movement Mouse moved suddenly. He heaved the huge rock up and smashed the grimacing warlock in the face with it, blood spraying, then once more on the back of the head, to be certain. The warlock fell with a wet thud, released from Azra's magic. His arm spasmed twice, earning another crystal to the brain from Mouse. Everybody fell quiet for the count of 10, listening for movement beyond the tent flap. Mouse finally exhaled and passed the sullied rock to the exhausted hedge witch, wiping blood from his hands onto his jacket. Not what I meant, Azra mumbled. Sorry I messed up your room, Mouse joked, ignoring the witch's comment. He turned to reclaim his knife. May, have you got the boy? Maebe retrieved her daggers and sheathed them at the base of her spine with a disappointed groan. The boy's still-bound hands draped over her neck. He was so thin and light. She hooked her hands beneath his knees, then nodded to Mouse. Are we running now? She asked Mouse desperately. You know it, he replied. Azra, was it? On 3, we'll leave this tent and head left. There's a path up into the woods. It was clear on the way in. If it's still clear, we're sprinting. You have that... He tapped his blade on the movement crystal. So stick close. 1, 2... Mouse ducked through the tent flap and shut it behind him. The witch stood waiting. Go! Maebe told Azra with a sigh. She stepped out after him and saw Mouse creeping ahead, following a line of tents. She daren't breathe. She wanted the feel of a dagger in her hand, but the scrawny boy on her back needed holding steady. The path they had descended was up ahead, and Mouse took off at a sprint. Azra followed closely behind them, hugging the rock with one hand and weaving a spell with another. What's he doing? Maebe panicked. She couldn't focus on the hedge witch and escape. Since hedge witches were often weak, many joined the warlocks to increase their strength. They dashed through the woods, as far as they could manage, when Mouse noticed Azra flagging behind them from the way to the crystal, and his time as a prisoner. He pulled them to the shadowing trunk of a camphor tree. Friend, Azra spoke. The witch's pupils widened, and his free hand clawed at the brown silk of Mouse's jacket. You need to hide that, he warned. Gods beyond, Mouse cursed, as he pushed Azra away from him. Get away! I tried to hide it with magic, but it will lead them to us once they notice it, Azra warned. Exhaustion forced him to place the movement crystal on the floor. Please, he murmured as he stood up. What is it? What's going on? Maebe asked, keeping her eye on the path behind them and resting the growing weight of the sleeping boy on an exposed root. Can they really feel it? Mouse asked intensely. Eyed the woods around them. I can feel it, my friend. Here, Azra offered. A small round-bottled vial appeared in his hand, half filled with dark fluid. Place it here. It should cover the scent of its power. Mouse grimaced and slipped a hand inside the pocket that was now on the outside of his jacket. His hand disappeared into the folds of smooth silk, then reappeared with an iridescent crystal shard between his fingers. An era shard. A finger-length fragment from a full cluster that could hold more power than any other crystal, used to create the barriers along the swamp border for members of the royal family, only with approval from the king. What's in the phial? Mouse asked Azra. Mouse, don't trust him, he's a hedge witch, Maebe pleaded. It's just a memory potion, friend, stolen from a former Night Guild associate in that camp. It's powerful enough to absorb some of the loose magic drifting off your shard, though, and keep us hidden," Azra crooned. Within a heartbeat, Mouse snatched the glass vial from Azra. He popped the stopper loose and dropped the Era shard within. The liquid inside bubbled and transformed into a colour as mystifyingly clear as the crystal itself. Azra's hair stood on end as he watched the flare in the tiny bottle. Within another heartbeat, the vial was magicked back into the hands of the hedge witch. "My thanks," he smiled at the astonished prince, then ran, leaving the perimeter of the movement crystal placed on the floor. "No!" Mouse shouted, sprinting after him. Without the weight of the crystal, Azra was faster. Mouse struggled to keep up, and Maebe caught up to him. "Take the boy," she offered, unhooking small hands from her neck. She passed him with barely a pause to stop, and flew into the woods after Azra. He was ahead of her, hopping over the branches and easing along the game trails. Maebe had no idea how to catch up to him. She could barely keep level behind him. They were both flagging from their escape, but he managed to keep himself ahead. Inspiration struck as she fished the dying flitter from her pocket and threw it at the running witch. It flew past his head, making him duck. "Stop throwing things," he called between panting breaths. Once more Maebe dived into her pockets and pulled out the used-up crystals from the night before. Heat and light. Heat was larger, striking him in the spine and making Azra bend backwards with a gasp as the shock of the impact. It was enough time for Maebe to throw light at his head. It stopped him in his tracks, a trickle of blood running from his scalp. "Seriously, ouch!" Azra exclaimed to her, hand massaging the tender spot on his crown. "If it means that much, then have your rock back." He pulled the vial from his pocket, liquid shining bright in the dappled shade of the trees. It shot through the air as he tossed it back to her. Maebe caught it with both hands, instantly hiding it in her pocket and away from the hedge witch's tricks. Azra tried to scowl, but his pupils went wide again. He sniffed deep in the woods around, gaze fixed on Maebe. "What?" she demanded, impressed with herself for getting the vial back, and annoyed by the witch who tried to escape with it. "Nothing," he muttered, confused. "No point having your rock if we're dead. Warlocks are closing in on the location of that wardstone. You better run." He turned and vanished through the trees. Maebe didn't bother following him. Mouse appeared between the trunks behind them, and she flashed the vial swiftly before pocketing it again. He nodded with a smile and carried on darting through the woods with the boy on his back. Together they bolted downhill until each breath stabbed them in the chest. Then they slowed and crept silently. Maebe watched her foot hover over the ground with each step until the sound could be absorbed into soft moss. Her ears strained for any noise in the thick woods around them.